The night air was thick with silence in Newbridge, a small town nestled between endless fields and forgotten roads. Marcus Harris kneeled on the damp earth by the railroad tracks, his hands trembling as they pressed against the blood-soaked shirt of Devin Miller. Devin's eyes were half open, his breath faint, but there was a distant look in his gaze, as if he had already begun slipping away. "Devin, please," Marcus whispered, barely audible, his voice cracking under the weight of disbelief and despair. The blood on his hands felt warm, sticky, a grim reminder that time was running out. Devin's body lay limp in Marcus's arms, lifeless. The soft hum of the distant train only amplified the eerie stillness around them. Lawrence Harris, Marcus's father, stood a few feet away, the gun still clutched in his hand. His expression wasn't one of fury, but something far more chilling, confusion, a kind of stunned paralysis, as if he couldn't quite comprehend what he had done. His eyes remained fixed on the scene before him, on the body of the boy he had just shot. The smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air, mixing with the dampness of the evening. Lawrence's lips parted, as if he was about to say something, but the words never came. His grip on the gun loosened, but he didn't let go. There was no movement except for the slow drip of blood from Devin's chest, seeping into the earth beneath him. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, loud and frantic, as if it was the only sound left in the world. Newbridge had always been a town of order, a place where tradition ruled every aspect of life. Founded in the 1800s, the town had prided itself on its strong moral code and unshakable religious values. The town's church, built in the heart of Newbridge, had stood as a symbol of its unwavering beliefs for over a century. The people here were devout, tightly bound by their faith, and resistant to any form of change. Outsiders often said that Newbridge was like a time capsule, where modernity had never quite found its way in. To the town's people, this was their strength, their shield against a world they viewed as sinful and corrupt. But beneath the surface of this perfect, idyllic town lay darker stories, whispered among the older generations. It was said that long ago someone had dared to defy the town's strict moral code. Rumor had it that a woman, Eleanor Braxton, had fallen in love with someone deemed unsuitable by the church. In retaliation, the town ostracized her, and the church elders took matters into their own hands. She was driven to madness, wandering the streets, begging for forgiveness until she finally disappeared, her body never found. Ever since, the people of Newbridge believed that those who broke the town's deeply rooted values would be cursed, their lives ruined as Eleanor's had been. The townsfolk didn't speak openly about the curse, but the fear of crossing those invisible lines was always present, always watching. As Marcus sat there, still clutching Devin, the weight of that unspoken curse seemed to hang in the air. He felt as though they had been doomed from the start, like the town had been waiting for their downfall. The quiet town, once his home, now felt suffocating, its traditions like shackles, keeping him bound to a fate he never asked for. He had heard the legend as a child, just like every other kid in Newbridge. The story had always seemed distant, a ghost tale told to keep children in line. But now it didn't seem so distant. Now it felt terrifyingly real. Lawrence's breath quickened as the reality of what he'd done slowly settled over him. He hadn't intended for it to go this far, but in Newbridge there was no room for what he had seen between Marcus and Devin. The town would never forgive it, and perhaps, he thought, neither would God. He looked at the gun in his hand, unsure of how things had unraveled so fast, and felt the crushing weight of that unspoken curse. The curse of defiance, the curse of love that could never be accepted. Marcus Harris, 22 years old, had spent his entire life in Newbridge, where his father, Lawrence Harris, had molded him into a reflection of the town's values. Lawrence was more than just a father. He was a deacon, a man who embodied strict religious discipline. For Marcus, freedom wasn't just limited, it was almost a sin. His world revolved around the rigid traditions of Newbridge, where the lines between right and wrong were clear, but suffocating. Lawrence's teachings left little room for personal exploration, and every decision Marcus made was shaped by the expectations of his family and the church. The Harris household was a place of rules. From early childhood, Marcus had been taught to attend every Sunday service, help with church events, and never question authority. Lawrence had an iron grip on Marcus's future. He envisioned his son becoming a pillar of the community, marrying a local girl, and continuing the legacy of religious devotion. Personal freedom, especially in matters of the heart, was considered dangerous and wrong. But Marcus harbored a secret yearning for something more, something beyond the rigid structure of his father's world. Meanwhile, Devin Miller, 20 years old, had just recently moved to Newbridge with his family. He had grown up in a larger city where life was more open and freedom was something he had taken for granted. His family wasn't religious like the Harrises, and their emotional distance left Devin feeling lonely. His parents, more concerned with their careers than with raising their son, often left Devin to navigate life on his own. This emotional gap made Devin feel like a stranger, even within his own home. But moving to Newbridge only intensified his isolation. The town's rigid structure and conservative views clashed with everything Devin had known. He had been used to blending into the crowd, but in Newbridge, every newcomer was scrutinized. The whispers about him being different were subtle at first, just curious glances and brief conversations. But as time passed, the small-town gossip grew louder. He found no comfort at home, where his parents, distant as ever, ignored the struggles he was facing in adapting to this new life. Devin discovered the Newbridge bookstore on an afternoon walk, hoping to escape the eyes of the town's judgmental residents. The bookstore quickly became a sanctuary, a place where he could hide among the shelves and lose himself in stories that offered a world far different from Newbridge. It was the only place in the town that felt like his, where he could momentarily forget about the expectations that weighed on him. On one of those quiet afternoons in the bookstore, Marcus and Devin crossed paths for the first time. It was an accidental meeting. Marcus had been running an errand for his father, picking up religious literature for the church. As their eyes met, there was an immediate connection, something electric and undeniable. Marcus, who had spent his life suppressing feelings he didn't fully understand, was stunned by the intensity of the moment. Devin, used to hiding his emotions behind a mask, felt the same shock of recognition, but tried to push it aside. For weeks after that first encounter, Marcus found himself returning to the bookstore, always at the same time, hoping to see Devin again. He couldn't explain why, but he felt drawn to him in a way that defied everything he had been taught. Devin, too, couldn't resist the pull of their connection, though it scared him to feel something so intense in a place like Newbridge, where anything outside the norm was met with suspicion. The attraction between them was sudden, powerful, and terrifying. They were two worlds colliding. Marcus, trapped in a life of obligation and fear of his father's disapproval, and Devin, desperately seeking connection in a town that seemed determined to reject him. As their interactions became more frequent, the tension between them grew, but neither of them dared to acknowledge what was happening. It was as if admitting their feelings would unravel the fragile balance they were trying to maintain. It was late summer, and the thick air hung over the town of Newbridge like a heavy veil. By now, Marcus and Devin's secret meetings had become routine, yet each encounter was charged with both excitement and fear. Their connection, once innocent and tentative, had grown into something deeper, more intense, something neither of them could resist, despite the looming dangers. That evening, they met by the edge of the woods, just outside town, near the old path that led to the abandoned train tracks. It was a place rarely visited by the townspeople, making it one of the few spots where they could meet without the constant threat of being seen. The tall trees shielded them from the world, and for a few hours, they could forget the rigid boundaries of Newbridge. Marcus leaned against a tree, his heart racing, as Devin approached from the shadows. The stillness of the forest around them was broken only by the sound of their breathing and the distant rustling of leaves. Every time they met, the fear of exposure gnawed at them, but it only made their moments together more urgent, more passionate. They spoke in whispers, careful not to let their voices carry too far, as though even the wind might betray them. One night, after closing hours, they met again in the back room of the bookstore, a quiet sanctuary they had come to cherish. The air inside was thick with the smell of old books and dust, the only light coming from a small lamp on the counter. Devin moved confidently through the space, but Marcus, always more cautious, couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be watching. The town had eyes everywhere. Caldwell, a man in his late 40s with a calm, measured demeanor, opened the conversation with a familiar tone. Marcus, your father tells me you've been struggling to find your path. This is normal, of course, but we must always remember that our actions reflect not only on ourselves, but on our families and our community. Lawrence nodded in agreement, his eyes fixed on Marcus. The pressure in the room was palpable. Caldwell continued, his words smooth but pointed. You know, the world outside Newbridge can be tempting. It's easy to lose sight of what matters most: faith, duty, family. But Marcus noticed something in Caldwell's tone, a subtle hint of understanding that made him uneasy. It was as if the pastor was suggesting that Marcus wasn't alone in his struggles, that maybe even he had been tempted by the same forces. The tension between Marcus and his father only grew after the consultation. Lawrence, more determined than ever, began imposing stricter rules at home. Marcus was required to attend every church meeting, help with community events, and participate in daily prayers, all while under his father's watchful eye. Lawrence even took it upon himself to involve Marcus in church leadership activities, hoping to immerse him deeper into the town's values. Marcus, suffocated by the increasing control, withdrew further. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. Marcus's interactions with Pastor Caldwell began to take on a different tone. During a second consultation on a quiet evening, Caldwell asked Marcus to stay behind after Lawrence left. As soon as the door closed, the pastor's demeanor shifted. He leaned forward, his voice lowering. Marcus, he said, I can see the weight you're carrying, and I want you to know, faith is important, yes, but you have to find your own way. Marcus was stunned. This was not the sermon he had expected from the pastor who had just lectured him in front of his father. Pastor Caldwell, it seemed, had his own view of freedom, though it remained hidden from the public eye. He hinted at having been in Marcus's position once, subtly suggesting that the path of tradition was not the only option. It was a dangerous contradiction to the life Lawrence wanted for Marcus, and Marcus found himself even more confused, unsure of whom to trust. As the weeks passed, the pressure from Lawrence became unbearable. Marcus was forced to go through the motions of church life while grappling with the internal turmoil caused by the conflicting messages he was receiving. On the surface, Pastor Caldwell remained a moral authority, but in private, he encouraged Marcus to think for himself, to consider choices that went beyond the narrow scope of Newbridge's traditions. Yet Caldwell's support was fleeting, and he offered no concrete solutions, leaving Marcus to navigate a path that felt more uncertain than ever. The town continued to watch, their whispers growing louder. People noticed that Lawrence was becoming more aggressive in his attempts to keep Marcus in line, and the more Lawrence tightened his grip, the more Marcus pulled away. The clash between father and son was becoming inevitable. Tony Wallace, Devon's former classmate, stumbled upon the truth by accident. He had always been somewhat of an outsider, not quite fitting into the tight-knit circles of Newbridge. Known for his sharp instincts and ability to manipulate situations to his advantage, Tony overheard a conversation between Marcus and Devon at the bookstore. At first, it was just a suspicion, but after watching them closely for several weeks, he pieced together the truth about their secret relationship. Tony's motivations, however, were far more complex than simple blackmail for money. He wasn't interested in cash. He wanted leverage, something he could use to manipulate the town's social dynamics to his advantage. He saw this secret as the perfect opportunity to wield power over Marcus and Devon. Tony confronted Devon alone after a shift at the bookstore. At first, he played the role of the concerned friend. I know about you and Marcus, he said casually, leaning against a bookshelf as Devon froze, his face turning pale. Tony assured him that he wasn't there to judge. In fact, he pretended to offer support, claiming he understood how difficult it must be to keep such a relationship hidden in a place like Newbridge. But beneath his feigned sympathy, Tony was playing a deeper game. He hinted at the consequences of their secret being exposed, but never outright threatened to reveal it. Instead, he offered Devon a twisted form of protection, help in exchange for Devon giving him information about Marcus's family, specifically Lawrence, who was a key figure in the community. Tony aimed to stoke the tensions between father and son while positioning himself as a hidden ally. Behind Devon's back, Tony began sowing seeds of doubt in Lawrence's mind. In subtle conversations after church, Tony hinted that he had noticed Marcus's strange behavior and suggested that maybe Marcus was falling under bad influences. Without directly implicating Devon, Tony stirred Lawrence's suspicions further, pushing him toward taking drastic action. His goal was to destabilize the Harris family from within, knowing that Lawrence's wrath would soon follow. Tony's manipulations were the perfect catalyst for the tragedy that was beginning to unfold. Devon's home life had never been easy. His parents, Mark and Linda Miller, were not as religious as the Harris family, but they had their own rigid expectations for Devon. They were career-focused, often absent from his life, and disapproved of Devon's independent streak. His move to Newbridge was meant to bring them closer as a family, but it had the opposite effect. Devon's attempts to connect with his parents were met with indifference. Devon often felt like a stranger in his own home. His parents didn't care about his personal struggles or his need for acceptance. The emotional distance was suffocating, and every time he tried to open up to them, they shut him down with cold, dismissive remarks. The pressure from the town's conservative views only made things worse. While his parents weren't directly religious, they still clung to social norms and saw Devon's independence as rebellion. One evening, after another argument with his father about his future, Devon realized just how isolated he truly was. His parents didn't understand him, and they weren't interested in trying. The only person who made him feel seen and understood was Marcus. But even their relationship was fraught with secrecy and danger. This isolation deepened Devon's connection to Marcus, who became his only source of comfort and real emotional connection. As Devon's parents distanced themselves further, Devon became more determined to make his relationship with Marcus work, even as the risks escalated. Marcus was losing his grip on reality. His father's relentless control, Pastor Caldwell's double-edged guidance, and the growing paranoia in Newbridge were taking a toll on him. The fear of being exposed had become unbearable, and at night Marcus began experiencing vivid nightmares. He would wake up in a cold sweat, haunted by images of the town's curse, seeing flashes of Eleanor Braxton, the woman whose defiance of tradition had doomed her. In his dreams, it felt as if the town itself was closing in on him, like an invisible force that wouldn't let him escape. As Marcus's mental state deteriorated, he began to have hallucinations. The whispers of the townspeople seemed louder. The eyes of strangers felt like daggers, and sometimes he could swear he saw the shadowy figure of Eleanor watching him from the distance. The curse of Newbridge felt more real than ever. Devon noticed the change in Marcus, his growing detachment, the haunted look in his eyes, and his increasingly erratic behavior. One night, after a particularly tense conversation, Marcus confessed that he had thought about ending it all. He couldn't see a way out of the life his father had laid out for him. The weight of secrecy, guilt, and fear was crushing him. Devon, shocked and terrified, refused to let Marcus fall into despair. "We can leave," Devon insisted. "We can run away, be together, somewhere far from here." Devon's words were filled with hope, but Marcus remained conflicted. The idea of escaping sounded tempting, but the fear of what Lawrence would do if they were caught hung over him like a cloud. Nevertheless, Devon's determination sparked something in Marcus. They began quietly planning their escape, hoping to leave Newbridge behind and find freedom elsewhere. Tony's manipulations had reached their peak. Through careful hints and suggestions, he had fed Lawrence's suspicions about Marcus's behavior. Lawrence, now convinced that Marcus was hiding something serious, became more controlling and volatile. Tony, meanwhile, continued playing both sides, keeping Devon close while subtly pushing Lawrence toward confrontation. One evening, Tony let slip a crucial piece of information to Lawrence. "I've seen Marcus with someone who doesn't belong in this town," Tony hinted, planting the final seed of doubt in Lawrence's mind. Lawrence's suspicions were confirmed when he discovered evidence of Marcus and Devon's plan to run away. Enraged and feeling utterly betrayed, Lawrence decided to take matters into his own hands. He couldn't allow his son to disgrace the family or the church. Fueled by fear and anger, Lawrence grabbed his gun and set out to confront Marcus and Devon, determined to stop them before they could leave Newbridge. The night was eerily still as Marcus and Devon stood by the train tracks, bags packed and ready to escape. They had chosen the late train, hoping the darkness would shield them from the town's watchful eyes. But as they waited, the sound of footsteps broke the silence. They turned to see Lawrence emerging from the shadows, his face twisted with fury, a gun in his hand. The confrontation that followed was filled with raw emotion. Lawrence accused Devon of corrupting his son, of leading him down a sinful path. "You've ruined him!" Lawrence screamed, his voice shaking with rage. Marcus, standing between Devon and his father, begged Lawrence to let them go. But Lawrence was beyond reason. In a moment of uncontrollable anger, Lawrence pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the night as Devon collapsed to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. Marcus, horrified, dropped to his knees beside Devon, trying desperately to stop the bleeding. But it was too late. As Marcus held Devon in his arms, he recalled the legend of Eleanor Braxton and the curse of Newbridge. It felt as though they had been doomed from the start. The wind howled, the moonlight casting long shadows across the ground, and in the distance, the whistle of the approaching train seemed like the final toll of fate. Lawrence was arrested for Devon's murder, his reputation in Newbridge shattered. The man who had once been a respected deacon was now seen as a pariah. The town, divided by their loyalties, whispered about the tragedy for weeks, but there was no doubt that Lawrence's actions had destroyed his family. For Marcus, the pain of losing Devon was unbearable. He couldn't forgive his father, nor could he stay in Newbridge, a town that had suffocated them both. In the aftermath of the tragedy, Devon's diaries were discovered. In them, Devon had written about his love for Marcus and his belief that they were destined to be together, despite the odds. He had even foreseen his own death, describing how the weight of the town's judgment would eventually crush them. Marcus, now far from Newbridge, wrote a final letter addressed to both his father and Devon. In it, he acknowledged that the world would never accept their love, but that it had been real, true, and worth fighting for.